Well, hello and welcome to the first episode of Perspectives on Sustainable Development. I'm Chris Whitehead, and I am very, very excited to be here today because this project has been a side thing for mine for about 5 months now, and I've been working on it, bringing people together, and have a lot of exciting things to share with everybody. Very quickly, my background's in technical work, mostly air quality for almost 20 years now as a consultant. But for the last 4 or 5, probably a little over that, I've kind of really found what I'm supposed to be doing with my life, I find, with environmental justice and climate change work. And coincidentally, in my opinion, they are a couple of the biggest drivers currently as we try to build out a better and sustainable world going forward. And the idea here, as I have been doing engagement work over the last half year, a little higher than that, and it's going to be edited out. I've seen more people ask us for educational opportunities and various ways they can get access to information. The general public is not going to have extensive background in these topics, but they will have interest often. How can they get that information and have that in manageable bites and hopefully come back from more on various associated topics? I'm really, really excited to say that I have about a dozen episodes already lined up in queue, and the basic concept for each one will be a couple of subject matter experts on individual topics, but each one tied to either climate change or environmental justice or one way or another. And the idea is that if we hear from multiple perspectives on the topics and challenge each other on various things and hear about the work we're doing, we're all better off for it. And a lot of my work over the last couple of years has been focusing on environmental justice, as I said, but more specifically to the point, the health impacts of particular matter and what that actually looks like on the state level. And then what can we put forward to hopefully identify challenges that might be coming our way. And I'm really, really excited again. I know I keep going back to that one word, but it's true. To have an opportunity to talk about issues that don't get talked about enough. Frankly, climate justice, the idea that the highest percentage of climate impacts and climate burdens are being felt by the underserved, the impoverished, the poor countries, but then also the overburdened areas in the United States. And climate change is interesting because it's the ultimate tiered model. If you change something up top, which is ambient temperature, carbon dioxide concentration, everything filters down and you make changes all around the world. And if you haven't figured it out by now, we are dependent on our planet to survive. That should not be a controversial concept, but unfortunately, in some circles, it is. I want to try to get that objectively just accept it going forward. That would be nice. But then also have the opportunity to talk to experts on individual topics and how we take carbon out of our economy sustainably. Unfortunately, there's not some magical switch you could flip today to just do it. These projects take time. What are the challenges about doing them? And what are the potential options that we might have pushed aside that we should take another look at? In my opinion, that's nuclear. And we're going to be talking about that as well. But without getting too long-winded, I want to also take the opportunity to now bring on our guests for today. I'll go ladies first here. Marisol Maddox is senior Arctic expert at the Woodrow Wilson Institute. And I promised her I would not read through her extremely extensive resume because I think that would take up the entirety of this episode. So I'll just say thank you, Marisol, for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And then let me also just bring on our next expert, would be Andy Bochman of the Idaho National Laboratories. Does a lot of Department of Energy work, and I think has one of the coolest not actual titles here, but I think it was the Grid Defender or the Infrastructure Defender I saw on LinkedIn. So that one made me smile, Andy.
I'm glad you like it. And it's wonderful to be here with Marisol and you today, especially for the inaugural episode.
It was important to me to do climate change first for a lot of reasons, but the biggest because it just affects everything else. So I think maybe a good spot to start would be could each one of you take a couple minutes just to kind of chat about how you got into this work and maybe a couple of the things you're currently working on?
Sure, yeah. So I did my undergraduate work in environmental science, and I took 10 years before going to graduate school for international security, because I was taking that time to try to figure out how I wanted to bring my different interests together. And it was during that period that I started becoming much more aware about climate change and changes to the cryosphere, particularly linked to when I worked at Glacier National Park in Montana and just saw the differences in the glaciers, and was also working in agriculture and noticing some of the changes. When you work close to the land, you notice those changes faster. And so started kind of questioning just some of the concepts that we have around homeland security, which for obvious reasons was very counterterrorism focused. But if the basic things that we need as humans to have prosperous societies are being challenged, things like water security and food security, we need to widen the aperture enough to understand how we need to evolve to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow, and to make sure that we're well situated to deal with that in 2050 and 2100. So my whole purpose in doing this work is to try to help to move us in a good direction to have ensured prosperity in the future and a future that kids can look forward to. And so that's what I work on, and focusing on the Arctic because it's the region that's changing the fastest and has immense global international security implications.
That's actually great that you answered that final part because that's exactly what I was about to ask you, how you chose to focus on the Arctic, but that makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. And actually, I think, Andy, how about you?
Well, I liked hearing Marisol say that she cares about people like kids. That suggests there's some empathy there. And we're looking for people with empathy who care not just about themselves, and not just about the current generation, but generations that are next in line and even further out than that, and want to give them a place to have a life and to enjoy the planet, right? That all seems to be in question right now. My background is primarily with cybersecurity and focused on the electric grid and more broadly critical infrastructure up until comparatively recently. I was at a conference in Park City, Utah a few years ago, pre-pandemic. It was a futurist conference, and so there were different types of cats and dogs there. I was there to interview the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States to talk about cyber attacks on the Ukrainian grid. This is before, obviously, the current war there, but we still had things to learn. At the time, we had things to learn about the attacks that they had recently suffered. And in a side, when you're at a conference, the cliche, or it's actually a truism, is that some of the most important stuff happens off stage,
Absolutely.
in the hallways, hallway con, right? And so I came upon a guy taking notes, looking like he was getting ready for his talk on this big stage. And it turned out to be somebody I sort of, I wouldn't say idolized, but I was familiar with, and was really excited that our paths crossed by accident. His name was Jim Baylog, and he had made videos, most famously at the time, Chasing Ice, where he set cameras up in glaciers. I think it was in Greenland, and taking still pictures with some interns for a year. When you combined all the pictures and turn it into a video, glaciers are like running around in a way that for generalists made the feeling that something's going on up there way more visceral, palpable
Sure.
than it would be before. Somehow there was a magic in the videos. through interactions with him and some oceanographers in that conference in the hallways and the sidelines, I was like, damn it. Yeah, cybersecurity is very important, and protecting the grid and water systems and transportation is very important. But this stuff is coming at us like a freight train. I I hereby resolve that I'm going to fill my head with climate risk, impacts to infrastructure, climate model data, the people that work them, so that I can be helpful in that aspect as well. And so that's where I am today. I'll tell you more about the types of things as your question sets teases them out, but that's my background, how I ended up on this podcast with you and Marisol.
Absolutely. That's very interesting stuff. And actually, Andy, we have something else in common there. Kind of actually, my sister works for GAO and was actually currently doing a number of reports on actually Ukraine aid and has been over there a number of times.
Wow.
So for a lot of reasons, I have great respect for people who put themselves out there and actually go and get into this stuff and are willing to actually examine this to the extent it has to be. I'm wondering, just to get started here, if either you want to take this. I always thought it was kind of interesting how climate change impacts start to pile up and start to show themselves in various ways, depending on exactly where you're from. And I'll give an example. In Philadelphia, I'm just outside there now, about a half hour away. We essentially don't have winters anymore. It kind of sucks. I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old who are just sad every winter that they can't go outside and play. And it's only one example, but I know plenty of people who think it's great. I don't. Do you think it's a challenge that um it's not static impacts depending on location?
I'll jump in real quick because just a silly side anecdote. I end up flying a lot, so I end up in Ubers and cabs a fair amount. And but having conversations with people in that line of work exposes you to a broad group that you might not otherwise if you're always doing professional stuff or with academics or national security people. And the last couple rides I've had, and I'm up here in Milwaukee in the upper Midwest, just off the shore of Lake Michigan, these people are used to winter.
Yeah.
And I'm from Boston, so I'm used to it too. And like you said, Chris, I like it, and it's part of the rhythm of life. When the cab driver or the Uber driver, when I get in their car and it's February and it's really nice out, comfortable out, like 50 or approaching 60. And I say, how you doing? How you liking springtime and winter? When the cab or Uber driver says, I like it and I don't like it, that says a lot to me. These are generally younger people and they know what's going on and they're worried, and nobody, like most people, they don't know what to do about it.
Sure.
They just know something is sideways and it doesn't augur well for the future, the way we're heading.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add that, obviously people in different parts of the world are experiencing this in different ways. And I've also had that same experience of, a very warm day in January where, it's nice to feel the sun on my skin, but I have this cognitive dissonance of I'm liking this, but I'm also deeply unsettled by it. And I've heard that echoed from many other people as well. But there are many other people around the world who are obviously experiencing this in already very extreme ways in terms of some of the extreme heat that we have seen in parts of the Middle East and India and other places. And then, of course, with the low-lying states and their existential threat, for these people, it's something that is, much more serious right now, right? And so it's a privilege in a way to only be affected to the extent that we are right now. But that will be changing, and and hopefully we'll be better prepared to deal with kind of the challenges that we know are coming.
And both of you kind of just alluded to this, but how large of a problem is it, would you say, or your opinion, I suppose, that this is such a huge issue and it's a daunting set of challenges what can the individual person do about any of this if they want to?
I try to not immediately go to things that gives you the illusion that action produces results.
Sure.
So from an environmental point of view, and I was always an environmental kid and guy, I want people to recycle. Um, I'd like people to, where possible, use the right or better energy efficient light bulbs, or have a hybrid or an electric car. Experiment with different things that are new technology that are more electric, because I'm aware of, we're not into it yet, but into all the emissions and mitigation things. At the same time, I don't want to trick people and say, if you buy a Prius or if you recycle, then we're going to be okay. I think most people intuit that already, but that's sort of what they're being sold, I think. When in reality, if you're a regular person, the man and woman on the street, and sometimes I'll say the men and women on the street, to the extent they can influence the men and women on the hill,
Sure.
or in positions of power in industry, voting, getting your voice heard as much as you can be, as much as you can amplify it. Those are things that might have a more tangible impact. Even as in your personal life, you might be trying to do things that are helpful too. The mountains that we have to move are so huge and so many. It's daunting. I want to give people the regular person, some ray of hope, something they can do, but I don't want to try to fool them either.
And personally, just to jump in too, I think it's understanding that it doesn't have to be a fatalism. Like this all isn't ending tomorrow. A lot of ways, it's just a level of risk thing, and understanding that the likelihood of various things happening is going up, unfortunately, and just trying to follow that into your calculus as to how you operate your everyday lives, obviously, but then also how you make large choices, and obviously that goes for business planning and supply chains, things like that as well.
Yeah, I would just add that, I think it is really important for people to feel empowered to be a part of the solution, and to, just from like a mental health standpoint, to feel like you're able to contribute to something that's bigger than yourself, right? And so this is where I think that in terms of the way that the government is approaching climate policy, it needs to be not just top down, but really bottom up also, and just really trying to unleash the energy that is bubbling under the surface, where a lot of people want to do something, but they feel like, they as one person just can't do enough, or they feel like it's not going to make a difference, or the problems just seem too big, and so they feel like, well, I just don't even want to know anything about it because it's too daunting and it's just depressing, and then that can kind of actually incentivize inaction and the lack of education, right? But what we need is, for people to understand like how much we need their engagement right now. But we also need government to kind of unleash those opportunities for people to engage in solutions, and I think just engaging people so they don't feel like passive bystanders to the apocalypse and just being bombarded with all of this really toxic imagery, like that's not good.
Maybe when you say government, maybe it's more likely, if you're going all the way from local to state to federal and things in between those, state, local, tribal, territorial,
Yes.
that if you get involved in your community, there's going to be like-minded individuals you can join forces with, and you may actually see it when a project that is under consideration leans more green than it otherwise might. I think you'll get some good feedback mechanisms there that then might encourage you to keep going and keep doing more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I actually gave a talk at Rowan University last week focusing on collaboration and the importance of innovating. And it was for postdocs and grad students. And one of the things I tried to tell them, and this is across the board, people going into biology, environmental sciences, basically anything you could think of. And almost all of you now have climate change jobs in one way or another. You have to start thinking about this stuff and how it affects your job. Yeah, so that talk I was giving at Rowan was, I think, important to stress the point that, especially because it was postdocs and grad students, the people we need to be coming into these industries passionate about taking on challenges like climate change to understand that they now, whether they knew it or not, a large part had climate change jobs. We touched on this a little bit before, but before I move on to start talking about tipping points, I wanted to just finish the idea that impacts are being felt around the world in various ways. Most people think about things tied to heat or tied to flooding, but I forget who it was. It might have been Marisol also brought up mental health, which is a large issue, and I think only going to be getting more challenging going forward as it relates to climate. But quick question for each of you: do you think there's a climate impact or a couple that are not getting enough attention right now?
I mean, I guess I think that really it's about the combination of climate change with many other factors that is underappreciated in terms of the types of challenges that it poses. And I absolutely think that human behavior is going to be one of the biggest curveballs that we have to deal with, because you can have policies that make sense, and there are certain assumptions that may go into certain policies about human behavior. And I think the COVID pandemic was an interesting one in terms of thinking, oh, well, if we just get the vaccines out, then everybody's going to do this, and then we can get in front of the spread of the pandemic. And that was not a safe assumption to make, right? And so those are the kind of things that, that need to be better thought through in advance. And I think that there are also some under leveraged opportunities to be evoking very positive human behavior responses that's really just underdeveloped. And I think it has incredible room for potential in terms of trying to address this in a positive way, and trying to help to cultivate the prospects of a positive vision for the future that we can work towards. Because I think that, if it's just a lot of this really negative imagery, there are ways that, people's behavior can kind of create more risk that then becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's something I think we have to be very careful about.
Agreed. And then there are challenging parts, like there's a huge effort, of course, now to convert to electric vehicles for the emissions benefits, climate benefits, etc. But on a fundamental level, people in this country still like their Chevys, and that's going to be a hard thing to get past. And I also like the point. Good, Andy, please.
I was going to say I have a response too to the behavior question, things that you think aren't getting enough attention at this moment. First, directly at behavior, my job as I've defined it is to try to change human behavior by writing things, by saying things, and sometimes doing things that could potentially get someone to reconsider their position on these matters. I think I mentioned to you in a background, Chris, earlier, that even though I'm in a national lab surrounded by scientists and engineers, and I understand Marisol has a national lab connection with Sandia too. The people that I spend a lot of time working with in that behavioral change aspect related to physical climate risk are folks that have a role to play. And that would be engineers and lawyers and people that write codes and standards and regulators and all kinds of people that could either push things forward or are slowing them down, financiers, people who don't understand yet the amount of risk that's coming at buildings and built infrastructure, things that are owned by municipalities that have to have credit ratings. So I work with credit ratings firms and insurers and reinsurers, all these various folks that have a role to play, and they're playing it, but they're not fully informed yet. I don't think they fully understand it. I'll finish this response thusly. Back to engineering and codes and standards. Everything that is built today, everything that exists that we call infrastructure, roads and bridges, uh, power generation, transmission, distribution, water, wastewater treatment, the communication system. All of those things were built, designed by engineers, approved by regulators, based on conformance to standards that looked backwards, that looked back at temperature regimes and precipitation regimes that were in the 50s, 60s, maybe up to 2000 if they're current, comparatively current. And the structures that they're building, because they're infrastructure, they're supposed to be out there for a good 30, 40, 50 years anyway. And the environments that they're going to be placed in are going to be nothing like what the codes and standards told them was the minimum they needed to build for. But the lag time is so huge in all of those various disciplines. The engineering standard of care against which they are judged, really pushing hard. And this will sound crazy, but every structure, every physical piece of infrastructure that matters, the critical infrastructure, needs to have a vulnerability assessment stat to find out whether it's going to be okay for the next 10, 20, 25, 30 years, or whether it needs retrofitting of some kind. And because that takes so long to get all that stuff approved and the money raised and the construction and work done, you better start now, depending where you are. And that's true in the United States. It's obviously true in all the other parts of the world too, but it's so horrifically huge a problem. People have a hard time fitting that in their brains.
Absolutely. And a couple of things to add on that one. Not only have the standards been written that long ago, but the public engagement models that tied to those standards, tied to all those projects, were the same forever. And they're only now starting to be updated slightly to give folks a chance to have input as to what's going on in their local communities, which is a big issue, a big topic for us. But just a follow up on that, Andy, to what you were just talking about. How much does the fact that a lot of the infrastructure, especially in our country, is starting to be well past its useful life complicate all of this?
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to need counseling after I answer this question, so I'm not going to go in as deep as I could. One unfun fact is that the hooks that held up the power lines in the Pacific Gas and Electric region, where you had the big fires, the Camp Fire, and others that led to the many people dying in the Paradise Fire. Some of those hooks, I think they're called ring hooks, were made out of iron, and they were over 100 years old. And they're up where the Santa Ana winds, which is sort of the villain for causing the fires, blowing the heat around and sparking the tinder. Those hooks, when they did the forensics, they found that those things failed. And who could blame them if you were 100 years old and you were made of iron and subjected to winds and heat all the time? But they in order to save money and give the shareholders more returns, they cut back on their maintenance. Oh, we don't need to do maintenance that often. It'll be okay. It was okay last year. It'll probably be okay next year. And I'm using those hooks that hold up the transmission lines as sort of the poster child for, as you allude to, so much infrastructure is something that we put off until later. If you had to like put one tagline with me, probably for all of this different work on this topic, it would be proactive. Be proactive. Stop waiting and hoping. Get out in front to the extent you can of these issues, and don't wait for them to come home to roost because it's already very late. So somehow we're gonna have to change people into being more proactive than they were in the past.
I would just add, there's one thing that I have been thinking about with that topic related to deferred maintenance. So things that, where basically we're not applying a climate lens to kind of be able to rack and stack priorities for deferred maintenance, like what should we be tackling first, right? And I think that having that lens of analysis that shows, okay, well, these are two things in the deferred maintenance list, but this one is has more near-term climate risk associated with it for climate hazards. So like maybe try to get to that first, right? Like just in terms of having to prioritize things, having limited resources. If you're going to start somewhere, like, you know, start with these, right? But first you have to do the assessment.
We use the term in risk management, which is the simplified version is risk equals impact times likelihood. Is it's likely something's going to happen, and how bad is it? What's the consequence going to be if this thing comes to pass? And the lab that I work at, the Idaho National Lab, the way that my colleagues always do this is to start with impact and consequence so that you might prioritize the things that matter most. So if you're an electric utility or a water utility, you know, sometimes they know when we do assessments with them, sometimes they have a sense for the key functions, the critical functions that they have to do to support their mission and which physical assets support them. But they haven't thought it all the way through. In some cases, they have blind spots and in their supply chain too. We would have them consider the climate risks, overlaying climate models, which are not perfect, but which are a far better tool than only looking backwards at a past that isn't the present and definitely isn't the future. And undertaking those vulnerability assessments and then those retrofits and hardening actions or adaptation actions on those things first. Once they're done, go on to the second level of the things that are the most important, rinse and repeat.
I'm happy you brought up a couple of things there, especially the supply chain aspect of this. And specifically, if you are looking at just hypothetically a larger company that might have locations in the United States and Europe and India, wherever the case might be, how important is it that they address these risks through the entire supply chain?
Marisol, you want to take a bite out of that before I do?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way that I see this is that we're not going to have a prosperous economy in 2050 or 2100 if we do not have businesses do comprehensive risk assessments to understand what are their climate hazards, and then how do we work together to build resilience in supply chains and to have these businesses be well suited for the conditions that they will be existing amidst, right? And so to me, it just, there's the conversation just seems very skewed because there seems to be this false perception that the status quo is actually an option, and it's not. We're either going to transition as well as we can proactively and try to shape the future in a positive way, or we're going to maintain, you know, kind of where we're at now and maybe some incremental change, and then have some serious shocks because we didn't do the due diligence to understand what we're going to be experiencing, right? So to me, it's like a no-brainer.
We would have wished that we had been more proactive while there was still a chance to be so in a period of relatively calm. Sometimes we'll say when low frequency, high impact events become high frequency, high impact events, you've lost your chance to plan in advance, because then you're just running around and just trying to put out fires everywhere because there's just too much going on all the time. When you talk about supply chain, I think about dependencies and interdependencies, and that a lot of people they just see their swim lane and they trust that everybody else is taking care of their business, and they hope that that's true too. I'll give a short example from a Homeland Security example. One time, a few years ago, the Department of Homeland Security, I won't say which part, but somebody near the top said, could you look at all 4 of our headquarters campuses for our different mission set and basically do what we're talking about here? Can you give us a sense for the climate impacts that appear to be approaching them by type and by approximately when they'll arrive? And then can you give us a sense for what type of engineering or hardening or adaptation options we might be able to undertake in advance so that those missions can continue uninterrupted? So we did that. We did that thing. I wasn't extremely rigorous. It was pretty easy to find out, just letting your fingers do the walking through Google and a couple other resources, what was coming and by approximately when and what they should do about it. But then here's the kicker, is that I said, by the way, if you only take care of your headquarters building or buildings in a campus, and you forget that everything that happens there and the success of the people in that building performing the mission is entirely dependent on the reliable flow of electricity and clean running water and wastewater treatment and transportation to and from that building and communications in and out of that building.
Absolutely.
If you forget and don't knock on the doors, so to speak, of those various infrastructure services providers and using whatever carrots and sticks you can, make sure they're awake and they're in motion on these things too, pause, then you might as well not worry about protecting your building, because it'll be all for naught if you pretend that that's all you have to do. That is assuming you really want to make sure, you really want to assure the mission.
Yeah.
And that's an uncomfortable message, because that's a heck of a lot more work than just taking care of your own thing.
Absolutely. But actually, I think that's a good segue too. I was going to show a quick graphic that I had of what they call the global tipping points. And
Oh, sure.
give me a favor, let me know if you see this.
I see it.
Beautiful.
Marisol sees it. Yeah.
Kind of touches on what Andy was talking about and enforces the fact that this is obviously a global issue. And for all those who don't understand, who might not have heard this before, what tipping point actually is, essentially the concept is if any of these elements go past a certain temperature threshold or a certain state, it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to get them back or to save that element, especially for the ecosystem services that they provide. And you'll notice here, of course, that there are large issues around the globe, from the Amazon rainforest to the Sahara to the Atlantic Ocean current, which has gotten a lot of press in the last couple months, and then of course to the Arctic, which Marisol is expert on. I wonder if you can comment. Well, I have a lot of questions to ask, but Marisol first, and you alluded to this in the open a little bit, but how has the Arctic changed over the course of your numerous visits?
Yeah, the Arctic is warming about 4 times faster than the global average, and it has been for the last several decades. And there are just tremendous changes that we are seeing. So, it's now clear that at lower levels of warming, we actually have higher levels of change than were expected when, for instance, the Paris Agreement was being negotiated. That's now very clear. And so, just having things like, rain on the summit of the Greenland ice sheet, which is just, then adding moisture, which kind of just goes into the feedback loops of, of the Greenland ice sheet melting. And then as it loses altitude, because it's about a mile high, so it's really quite high. But as it loses altitude with the melting, it is then exposed to warmer air temperatures, which then exacerbate the warming. And then also when you get rain and you get the ice melt on the top of the Greenland ice sheet, as it rolls off the ice sheet, it actually rounds out the edges of the ice sheet and creates more surface area, which then exposes more of the ice to the warm air temperatures, and then again feeding into this kind of warming and melting and warming and melting. And the Greenland ice sheet, because of the way that oceanic circulation works, is actually disproportionately affecting sea level rise on the east coast of the United States. And so the East Coast has kind of a dual challenge of the fact that the world is made up of different tectonic plates, and the plate on the eastern coast of the US is still moving down a bit. And so you have land subsidence that is coinciding with the rising of the sea. And so that is really enhancing the risk of sea level rise to that area, and certainly also with storm surge and things like that. But that's just one example. There's obviously many here, and there's now much more advanced ability with science to have attribution between specific changes in a part of the world that are linked to an extreme weather event in another part of the world. So again, with Greenland, there's actually a direct link between the loss of the Greenland ice sheet and a dramatic decrease in monsoon precipitation in the Sahel region of Africa. There's also there was an extreme storm in Europe in 2018 that was called the Beast from the East. And through looking at the geochemical thumbprint of the atmospheric vapor of that storm, scientists were able to directly link it. They could tell that it actually was a result of long-term sea ice decline in the Arctic. And so there's a kind of growing level of attribution that is now possible that just shows that changes in one part of the world have an effect on other parts of the world, and that we are dealing with very complex interactive systems. And so in order to appreciate why these changes matter, you need to understand that you have to think in terms of systems and to understand kind of the scale of what we're dealing with.
That was a great explanation. This is Andy. You probably will want to edit this entire sequence out. Here we go. Last year was 2023 was the hottest temperature since we kept formal records of global temperatures starting in 1850. Last year was also the highest emissions of CO2, methane, greenhouse gases ever recorded. How can that be when we started the Council of Parties COP meetings with world leaders and scientists getting together every year in 1995? And so we just had, I think, the 28th one, and we're getting ready to do it again, and we'll keep doing it every year, it seems. And how can it be that we've had 6 full IPCC reports, the most authoritative gathering of the most authoritative, respected scientists in climate, and each one gets more confident in its claims from observations and its projections about what's coming and what needs to be done about it. So in the context of in the context of tipping points, which are like dominoes that are set up and getting ready to pushed over, and once you set one in motion, it's really hard to stop them. Everything that we're doing is the wrong thing. Sorry, that's not the right way to say it. All the things that we're doing are not solving the problem. We are building more renewables in the United States and deploying them, and that's good. However, we're not keeping up with the increase in electricity demand from data centers that are hungry to run clouds and more AI, and from the electrification of everything, and from electric vehicles and the boost in American manufacturing. This is a very US-centric response, but it does apply in other parts of the world too, particularly in Europe and some parts of Asia. We're going to need to build more natural gas plants because we've been shutting down coal plants, and we're not going to have enough electricity to keep the grid from going into blackout and brownout conditions. That's an energy security thing, where we'll be trading off the security of the present for even worse challenges in the climate change and potentially knocking down a tipping point or two. And by the way, they do cascade. We need to get people to act much differently than they are today if we want to avoid going to this tipping point situation.
Actually, Andy, for the record, I don't think I'm going to edit any of that out. That was a very solid answer.
I don't like it. I don't like it.
Fair enough. Okay. You touched on a lot of stuff there. And before I came on this podcast today, I did a little homework on both of you, a couple of papers you've done over the last couple of years. And I know, Andy, the topic you brought up about how coal had been a very stable energy supply for us for a very, very long time. We're taking it down now for emissions reasons and public health reasons, but that still leaves a vacuum of stable energy. I know from your papers you think that it can be nuclear that helps take over that spot. I wonder if you want to talk about that a bit.
I'll do it really briefly.
Sure.
The lab that I work at, and obviously other national labs and federal government interests and the private sector, are super interested in exploring a nuclear renaissance with small modular and micro reactors. I asked a congressman once, who's a GOP congressman, who said that there's a nuclear renaissance, and he said it was probably because of climate change concerns. And I said, "Are you're able to say that as a GOP person, a Republican?" He said, "Yeah, we say that because it's moving a lot of money in Washington, but we often don't talk about it in public." The upsetting thing for me, as fast and as hard as everybody's working to bring these next generation of nuclear reactors online, now that climate concerns are outstripping nuclear energy concerns, and both are significant, is that it's still going to be a ways in the future. It's getting closer. It's not that ever receding 30-year horizon that people associated with fusion energy, but it's not going to be tomorrow that the NRC blesses these things, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that we build the gigafactories that start rolling out the pieces using economies of scale, and we get out a dozen and then 100 and then 1,000 to places in the United States and the rest of the world. They're all interested in them, especially the rest of the world. It's going to be the work of another decade or two before those things are real. And we need them to be ready like now to keep the grid going, to meet those new electricity demands with something other than new gas plants. But right now, the tarot cards are suggesting it's going to be more gas plants. And that means this might have been one of the things you happened upon, Chris, that I'm projecting we're going to blow our emissions targets out, that an individual company or a government agency will be able to say, we're net zero by whenever they said. But when you roll it all up and say, how's that state doing? How's that country doing? They're going to have to backtrack and put that off, set those targets further in the future than they already are. And they already are pretty far in the future from a tipping point concern point of view.
Speaking of those targets, there's been a lot made about 1.5 by 2030 and whatever metric you want to pick. Could you guys speak for a little bit about how those targets were initially set and how climate models have to be adapted over time as more and more information is processed? And unfortunately, it seems that even a lot of times the worst predictions in climate models oftentimes don't even catch up to what's actually happening, depending on, of course, the situation that unfolds before that.
Well, I'll just say that when thinking about the Arctic, there is a major gap in the carbon accounting linked to the permafrost thaw in the Arctic. So currently, scientists believe that the permafrost in the Arctic, which is covers about 15% of actually the northern hemisphere, that what is supposed to be permanently frozen ground is now thawing as the temperatures are increasing, and it has the potential to release insane amounts of emissions. And it's not just carbon dioxide, it's also methane. Right. And the Arctic is actually transitioning to a rain dominant form of precipitation. That's like the larger trend line. And so as it gets wetter, the proportion of methane actually increases relative to carbon dioxide, which methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas in the near term. So could really basically shrink the timelines that we have to avoid really serious warming. And scientists believe that currently the permafrost is already like a top 10 country emitter equivalent, about the equivalent of Japan's current emissions. And that if we do not reduce emissions seriously and sequester carbon as well, that those emissions will just increase further. And that really shrinks the amount of the carbon budget that we have to work with to reduce, to keep warming within an acceptable level. And it's also not accounted for in our climate models. So the IPCC, for instance, actually takes the average of the different climate models, and there's only currently one climate model that includes permafrost thaw, but it's only in a linear way. So it doesn't account for any of the abrupt thaw events that we have been seeing many of in the Arctic, where you'll have a sudden release of a massive amount of emissions, and that's completely missing from the models. And it's scientists are working on it, but it's very challenging to be able to account for.
I was just looking up for one of the biggest misses that I hear climate scientists referencing when they're talking about how climate models seem to be generally right, and yet, to Marisol's point, they are never fully right, and sometimes they're way wrong. I think one of the biggest myths that I keep hearing about, and I just looked up to make sure I had the timing right, was in late June and early July 2021, what happened in the Pacific Northwest in North America, where temperatures in Canada reached 49.6 degrees Celsius, or for the Fahrenheit people, that's 121.3 degrees.
Jesus.
In Canada. And these numbers blew what the projections from the best climate models were. They exceeded them like by 4 degrees centigrade, which is a huge, huge miss. And people still now are trying to go, what the heck happened? And what is it that we're missing? For folks that aren't that familiar or aren't at all familiar with climate models, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, how do we know they're right? They're talking about the future. And so let me mention briefly that what has been used in the past and in the present is called backcasting. So if you imagine, take yourself back to the year 2000, and there were climate models in 2000 for sure, and earlier than that. And they were running on slower computers, and they didn't have all the fine tuning and variables and basically the information that they have now. So let's just say they weren't as good. If you take what they were projecting for temperatures in different parts of the world back in 2000, what were they projecting for 2020? You can see that they're mainly right. They really did a great job, even though they were slower and less refined, less sophisticated than our current ones. They generally were on the money. And therefore, this is like logical deduction. If you come to our times in 2020, 24, I think we can say that they are getting better all the time. To Marisol's point and to the miss in Pacific Northwest, they're gonna have some blind spots. And one last point in my doom and gloom aspect is that when tipping points start tipping over, they're not going to be worth anything because they're not built for that. They might be able to project tipping points, but once that's a sort of a runaway effect, there's not much point in having climate models at that point. I think somebody might argue that. I'm saying that like I'm very confident. I'm not a climate modeler. I could be completely off, but I have a sense that that's likely. It will be too dynamic and too unstable. Marisol, you want to correct me on that?
I mean, I'll just say I think it's best to not test the scenario and understand what would happen. And so I'm in favor of us just getting climate action and the level of ambition right, so that we never have to find out.
That's good. It's a good point of view.
I'll second that, definitely. And something I try and stress with folks, and we speak to a lot of various industries, and the importance of trying to do sustainable planning on large scale projects, and thinking both the economics, with the environmental, but also the social aspects of each choice we make. I want to switch gears a bit and talk to you both a little bit about climate change as a national security and geopolitical issue. And just as an example, Marisol, obviously your work focusing on the Arctic. What happens as the Arctic starts to thaw more and more, and you have navigation routes and mining options that you didn't have previously?
Yeah, so just as the region is becoming more accessible, so the Arctic Ocean traditionally has been ice covered, and as the Arctic ice cap is thinning and shrinking, there's just more interest from various parties in having presence up there. So things like, tourism vessels that are going up, like cruise ships going up earlier and staying later. Of course, the prospects of maritime routes that could reduce the voyage time between Asia and Europe by a couple weeks. Some of these routes are developing, but there are depth and width constraints through some of the straits that do prevent these major cargo ships that have come to be for this just-in-time shipping model that we currently have. Those are too big to go through these routes. So, the Suez has about 1 billion tons of cargo that goes through every year. And, it's a small fraction of that very, very, very small fraction of that even, that Russia is aiming for. So, it has to be kind of calibrated in terms of the expectations. But basically, the idea is that there is more activity. And one of the big challenges is that the search and rescue capabilities are very limited. The infrastructure is very limited. So if there is some type of incident, like an oil spill or a search and rescue incident, the ability to detect it, that even can be a challenge just because of the issues with high latitude communications. There's a lot of issues with the lack of satellite coverage because many of the satellites that go around the Earth are geostationary, meaning they go around the equatorial region. And so because of the curvature of the Earth, they cut out right around the Arctic. And so you have like kind of limited coverage there, but then just also limited assets that can respond, right? So the United States, for instance, only has one icebreaker for the Arctic. And, sometimes it has to undergo maintenance and, so Coast Guard basically has a larger and larger area of responsibility with actually some shrinking resources, especially because they're not a part of Department of Defense.
Interesting.
I don't have anything helpful to say in this. I wish that wasn't happening.
I'll second that. But I was just wanted your opinion, both of you, on whether or not you think that focusing on impacts that climate has on large interests like national security, like potential impacts to military, to infrastructure, gains any more traction than the less tangible, or possibly phrase another way, is it important to focus in as much as we possibly can on what these impacts are to have any hope as to potentially actually alleviating them a bit?
I'll just start with the DoD in the United States has always been the most aware and the most active on climate matters from an impact point of view. They also, from time to time, depending on the administration, will work on emissions too.
Yeah.
But they're an organization that can't fool around with their mission or being politically correct. They've got to make sure that they understand the future as best they can in ways similar, but obviously different than the way an insurance company or a credit ratings firm needs to understand the future the best they can to stay in business. The DoD needs to understand what's coming so that they can do their mission. And so like I said, they're not fooling around about it. You'll hear them critiqued sometimes by folks that are, how do we say, climate deniers, or they just think that nobody needs to do anything. But the military can't respond to them. It needs to make sure that its planes, its ships, its bases are a big deal that are coming under pressure. I think the poster child for that situation in North America is Norfolk, which is the largest naval base in North America, maybe anywhere. And they have significant sea level rise issue that's threatening dry docks. The dry docks, which hold multi-billion dollar nuclear submarines, when they take their skin off to do maintenance on them, and it would be ruined if those dry dock walls were overtopped by storm, by salt water, etc. So that's a national security frame, and there's a lot more to it than that from a climate point of view. But you can just ripple out quickly. This has everything to do with the economy. This has everything to do with public health. This has everything to do with agriculture. So why wouldn't you be more proactive on it than you have been already? Why would 2023 be the hottest year on record and the highest emissions year on record if it's that impactful across all those domains?
It's it's kind of sad, Andy. I almost at times feel like the news stories on how this year on record is kind of like bad Mad Libs, and that's dated myself a little bit there. But 2022 hottest year on record, 2023 hottest year on record. It almost feels like it's gonna change the year, but the headline is gonna stay the same.
Yeah, that's right.
I know we don't have that much time left, but one other aspect I wanted to quickly address, because this one hits home for me, how unfortunately women in sciences and general across industries are unfortunately confronted with various biases that I can speak personally as a man. I know I don't have to actually confront. I'm trying to learn more about them as I go forward, but I learn more about this stuff every day, and I try to learn more about everything I deal with every day, which is again definitely a driver for this podcast. Marisol, wonder if you wanted to comment quickly on the topic and how you stay centered on the work that you do every day.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, thanks for bringing it up. I would say, though, that the vast majority of the people that I work with are absolutely lovely. And I just focus on, the working with people who I think have the right attitude and, just appreciate me for the expertise that I bring, right? It's just about having kind of respectful collegial relationships. And every once in a while there's something that will come up that is kind of goofy, and I'll let the person know that they're being pretty goofy. And I think just not really tolerating any nonsense, but also recognizing that most people are wonderful to work with. And but it is definitely important to kind of to be aware of any type of prejudices that may exist, and to address them appropriately when they present themselves, and just basically not positively reinforce any type of behavior like that. And then just to convey that it's best if we're just having professional interactions, right?
Absolutely.
And I'll add what I said in a previous talk briefly, which is I come from a tribe of cybersecurity people, and there are women in cybersecurity, and we work hard to get more in, but that's because it's such a deficit. We're trying to get full representation and diversity in all its forms, because better decisions come from more diversity.
Absolutely.
That's not even a fairness thing. That's sort of a ruthless, let's get better decisions by getting all the people involved, you know, who have something to add. But it's also fairness too. Um, I was happily surprised, or I've been happily surprised, that in the climate space, whether it's on the mitigation side, reducing emissions, or on the adaptation and resilience side, that there's just a lot more women.
Yeah.
I have my own ideas why that might be, but either way, I'm just happy to see it. And I hope Marisol and others are subject less and less to what she calls very gently goofy behavior as people grow up and grow up.
I'll absolutely second that. And just to echo something that both of you said before a couple of times, I think it's critically important that we understand on climate going forward the need to collaborate, to hear from different perspectives, to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, but also obviously reduce emissions going forward and try to make these hard choices sustainably and bring all these different perspectives to the table. And because we're kind of wrapping up here, I'd like to give you guys both an opportunity to do any final thoughts you might have.
I'm doing the ladies first thing. In
Okay.
the sense, it could be a cruel thing. I apologize.
No, no, thank you. Yeah, I guess so. I just want to kind of hold space for the fact that this is a very challenging topic to really delve into, because it is upsetting. And so first, anybody listening, I appreciate that you are showing up and wanting to educate yourself more to understand what we're dealing with. And I think it's just really important to have compassion for the lived human experience of living amidst the climate crisis, and to not lose sight of the fact that there are many wonderful people who are not going to be giving up and who will be working on this. And so it's just about finding each other and finding ways to identify leverage points to create change that we need to see to have a future that we can look forward to. And to just really, it's not about having hope that's just hope for the sake of hope. It's about understanding that we do have agency. We have a window of opportunity to really shape the future that we have. And so let's work together and let's do this.
That was lovely. And I would do well to listen to voices like Marisol's more often, or as often as I can, because I definitely live on the dark side quite a bit, dark matter. And so my closing bell statement is, there's two sides to the climate challenge. There's the reduce emissions, which we generally call mitigation. And even though I said that thing about 2023, we can't give up on that. We've got to do everything we can to try to turn people around and figure out ways to start bringing it down, bringing emissions down, stabilize the climate before solve the climate, stabilize. But because I come from a infrastructure defender background, as Chris highlighted,
that was the time. Thank you.
My job is to be looking at the infrastructure and waking people up as much as I can in ways that are effective, using carrots and sticks, all the different types of folks I mentioned, to try to make sure that the lights stay on and the water keeps flowing and you can still drive, you can still get where you need to go, and you can still communicate on Zoom and other ways as much as possible, to be proactive and not wait for the impacts to start hitting us harder than they already are. And they are hitting, obviously, in different parts of the world with different intensities and different frequencies. So I'm always putting in the word for adaptation and resilience. That no matter what we do on mitigation, we better start putting some significant time, attention, and money into adaptation and resilience. Right now, Alice Hill in the Council of Foreign Relations, she was a presidential advisor, calls it adaptation and resilience the poor stepchild of mitigation. And I think it needs to be really on equal footing, not to slow down on mitigation, to speed up on both quite a bit.
Absolutely.
And thank you for hosting this thing so we can get some of these messages out, Chris.
Thank you, Andy and Marisol. And on that final point about the importance of education on this. For anyone who is looking for more information, there is countless websites available to dig into this more. I'll be posting some with the episode itself, some of the favorite ones I have, and I'll ask Andy and Marisol to also contribute to that, as well as I'm going to also post, as long as they approve this, a paper that each one wrote that I thought was particularly impactful on these topics. And I'll just say too, obviously, thank you for joining us today. And if you what you heard here today, we have, as I said earlier, about 10 episodes already lined up behind this on environmental justice, building decarbonization, basically every topic you can think of that touches EJ or climate change. And I've been extraordinarily humbled and thrilled by the response this has gotten. So I hope to be doing more of these, and I know I learned quite a bit today. So again, thank you, Andy, Marisol.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for bringing us together, Chris, and good luck.
Absolutely.
We'll both, Marisol, I don't mean to speak for you, but we'll try to tune into some of your next shows. It's been a good
Absolutely.
experience.
I appreciate that. Spread the word.
Yes.
Bye for now.